morning, everyone. My name is Andrea Reimer. Some of you might be getting sick of hearing that because it's my third week in a row hosting a webinar series for the She, They, Us campaign, but it's a pleasure once again to be joining you today from the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. You can find out a little bit more about me at the link that is going to be pasted into the bio so that you all know Ange is the name of the person who is running the show behind the scenes. So Ange will be pasting it into the bio. Before I dive in on what we're here to talk about today, I would really love you to hear from Janice Abbott, who's here as a result of the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing, a national project focused on ensuring housing policies across Canada include and prioritize women, children, and gender diverse people. And she's here to tell us more about the Pan-Canadian Voice campaign and why they're working on this project. Welcome, Janice. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks, Andrea. Huge thanks to everyone who's online joining us today. The group of people we have as panelists are definitely folks who have the ability to influence and even direct housing policy to positively impact women, children, and gender diverse people. So in the spirit of the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing, I'd like everybody online to ask hard questions, be thoughtful, and hold everyone accountable. No pressure on the panelists. So thank you all for being here. For those of you who may not have heard of the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing before today, it is a national project. We have women and gender diverse folks from across coast to coast, ocean to ocean to ocean, who participate throughout the year leading up to an annual symposium in October. We've developed 6 flagship calls to action, but more importantly, perhaps we've created space for women and gender diverse folks from across the country to get together and talk about all of the issues that impact us. And part of the point of this campaign is to also develop skills so that we can lobby wherever we are in the country. I don't want to take up too much time because I know we all want to hear from the panelists. So thank you, Andrea, and welcome. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Janice, and thanks for being the host for this series that we've been putting on. So as I mentioned today off the top, and Janice mentioned, today is the third of 4 webinars we're doing to kick off the She, They, Us Making Room in Housing campaign. On February 15th, we did a reality check on where we're at with housing generally, and specifically on the gender-specific crisis that women, children, and gender diverse people face within the larger national housing crisis. And we had some thoughts about solutions. Last Monday, so the second week, we had a power hour where we had 3 folks joining us trying to track down who ultimately has the power to make better housing decisions. You can find both those recordings online, and just going to paste that link in the chat. Spoiler alert, I'll tell you the answer before you watch them, but I think the conversation is worth listening to see how we got to the answer. The answer is that all of us have the power, and the way we action that power for many of us is through using our voice. So today we have the logical next step in our journey. We have 3 folks who've all been power holders here to talk to us about how the voices of those with lived expertise had an impact on the decision-making that they've been doing in their respective offices. So 3 folks. First up is Grace Lohr. Grace Lohr was elected the MLA, an MLA in 2020. She's the Minister of State for Childcare, having previously served as the Parliamentary Secretary for Gender Equity. Prior to the election, she taught in the Department of Political Science at University of Victoria and previously at UBC, where I teach as well. Grace has worked very closely with the Victoria Sexual Assault Centre and other anti-violence organizations to create inclusive, accessible, and survivor-centered sexual assault response. Next, we have David Miller. He is the Managing Director of the C40 Centre for City, Climate Policy and Economy. Mr. Miller was Mayor of Toronto from 2003 to 2010 and served as Chair of C40 Cities from 2008 until 2010. Under his leadership, Toronto became widely admired internationally for its environmental leadership, economic strength, and social integration. He's a leading advocate for the creation of sustainable urban economies. So we got province, we've got city, and we also have national. Romy Bowers is here with us today. She was appointed President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation in April 2021. She leads a team of housing experts who share a single goal: that, quote, by 2030, everyone in Canada will have a home that they can afford and that meets their needs. As CEO, Romy believes CMHC can be a catalyst for solving housing affordability challenges and a leader in building a housing system that is equitable and free of systemic racism. Prior to joining CMHC, Ms. Bowers had a diverse career in the Canadian banking industry. There are more details about her experience in the chat. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this hour. David, I know this is a trope where we sort of start with cities and then sort of work our way up, but I would love to start with you. You're a former mayor of Canada's largest city, Toronto. I feel like I probably didn't need to say Toronto is the largest city to a largely Canadian audience, but just to clarify that you've had a lot of experience with community advocates coming to City Hall. As we heard at last week's webinar, City Halls are really the front door of government for most people. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what that's like, but I think first people need a little bit of context. And so I'm going to ask you one of the questions I hated most when I was elected to local government, but what is an average day like for a mayor?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me on this panel, and I really look forward to hearing my panelists' remarks and interventions and the questions and comments from everyone participating. I think that's a great question. I mean, the first answer is it's great. Second answer is it's insanely busy. But one of the privileges of being a mayor, or I think the minister would agree, a cabinet minister or a deputy mayor, as you well know, Andrea, is that you can actually help make the change you believe in happen. So a typical day for me when I was mayor, I'd get up at about 5:30. I'd go to the gym. Well, that's later in my term as mayor.
Aspirational goal.
Aspirational goal. No, I did change my behavior. Early on, I had 2 quarter pounders with cheese for dinner every night, which caused me to have to go to the gym. Then you'd typically have radio interviews, say starting around 7 a.m. Then there'd often be a breakfast event with a community organization or a union organization or business group. Some days there were council meetings or committees. If there weren't, there'd be a series of meetings on issues in my office, so I could get briefed on the progress, whether it was housing, public transit, the work we did called Streets to Homes to help street-involved homeless people get a place to live, or environmental issues. Working closely with the public service to push those issues. On a council day, of course, I'd be in council. Sometimes at lunchtime, there'd be media, other appearances and speeches. By the end of the day, there'd be community events. And I'd get home probably 10 or 10:30 and start it all over again. And that's pretty much most days, except Sundays. I didn't go to the gym, and nobody wanted their local politicians, even their mayor, before about 10 in the morning and not after 8 or 9 at night. So that was a bit of a lighter day. But that's the typical day. It sounds busy, but it is wonderful, because what your role is to bring together the people of a city and their organizations around a common vision and do your level best to try to make it happen.
Amazing. And you didn't even mention emails and tweets and DMs and PMs and IMs and all the other M's.
You know, I was in office when Twitter started. I'm a very early adopter. It's ridiculously addictive, but you're right. It's changed a lot of politics and selfies.
Right.
The number of selfies, I mean, I can tell some stories about that, but I won't waste people's time unless people ask in the questions. But the number of selfies elected officials have to take these days, and answer social media, and be available, and listen, which is the most important skill of an elected official, in my view, is really being able to listen and understand, so that you can really meet people's needs.
So that's a great springboard, because I wanted to get that context. It is, like people I think look at me somewhat skeptically when I say that I used to work 90 to 100-hour weeks, but it is in fact that busy if you're really meeting all the needs in the community. So in that context, let's talk about community advocates. And so there's community advocates coming from groups. So they have, maybe websites and email, like enough infrastructure to advocate within an organizational context. But I'm really thinking about the people who've just lost their home because of a flood, who are dealing with domestic violence and need someone in power to help them. You're really busy when you're elected. You've got all these inputs coming in all day long. How do you situate the voices of those community advocates and individual experiences in all of that?
Well, first of all, the one thing I should have said, just to build on your comment, is a mayor or a minister or a deputy mayor is booked in 15-minute increments. 15 minutes after 15 minutes after 15 minutes all day. So a good elected official who wants to ensure that community challenges and needs are met and is really trying to listen is inundated. And so it's extremely important and very helpful for people to organize as advocates so that they can speak with a clear voice and one voice. And I found this terrifically helpful as a city councillor and as mayors on housing issues for women, for example. There's an organization named Sistering in Toronto that is a place that assists two groups of people, street-involved homeless women and women who are leaving an abusive relationship and in transition. And I learned what the city could do to help the people that Sistering was serving by Sistering's advocacy on behalf of the people they were representing. Now, that's an organization. There are many, networks of people that seek common goals. It doesn't have to be an organization that's providing services, but it really assists because you don't know all the answers as an elected official. You have superb advice from the public service, but I got elected after a conservative, and the public service had years of a conservative mayor and was used to giving answers that were about not spending money. I needed the public service to give answers about how do we solve problems. And the community role in helping create solutions was really important. The last point I'd make on that is that local government particularly is structured in a way, sometimes because it legally has to, that it engages with people directly in their communities. It's set up to listen to people. So it's exceptionally important in making change for people to speak up through those mechanisms. And I'll just give you a quick example if I got one more second, Andrea.
Yeah.
When we revitalized Regent Park, which was Canada's oldest social housing project, it was near the end of its life. And on the advice of the then head of Toronto Community Housing, Derek Ballantyne, we went directly to the people who were living there at the moment we knew we had to rebuild before any plans had been done. We knew two things. The housing had to be rebuilt because it was the end of its life. Secondly, when it was originally built, it had cut off the neighborhoods around it. And we knew that it needed to be part of the neighborhoods, that people shouldn't be stigmatized. They should be part of a broader neighborhood. But nothing else had been planned. We went right to the people at the beginning, and they spoke up. And the development that resulted was largely framed to meet the needs expressed by the residents in those very early meetings. And it was exceptionally important for the advocates and for the people who are living there to speak up. So what did people say? We want a grocery store. There wasn't one. We want a bank. There wasn't one. It's often true in low-income neighborhoods. If you're going to spend $1 billion building in our neighborhood, we want our children to have jobs. And all of those are much more. We want the highest environmental standards in our buildings because we want to live in really good buildings. And we want to do our part to fight climate change. These comments came from advocates and from residents. Exceptionally important. It changed the entire project. And if people don't speak up and give their lived experience, it's much harder for an elected official, even one who wants to solve the problem, to meet their needs.
Yeah, an excellent point. Well, and a great segue to Grace. I'd love to bring you into the discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate all of you, but Grace is actually the legislature is sitting right now, and I know I haven't been in that position, but I can only imagine what it's like trying to cram another hour into an already busy day. So thanks for being here.
I'm so glad to be. I really appreciate the opportunity to listen and to talk. I think the topic is so important, talking about lived experience, the voice of advocacy. I mean, these are the kinds of things that brought me into this world. So really glad to add it in.
Cool. Well, so you are relatively new to elected office. You were elected in the last BC general election, which was 2020. But I actually wanted to start before elected office. You have a long history of working in community, including as a community organizer in housing and as an anti-violence advocate. Can you tell us a bit about your time working in community and how that work involved trying to bring the voices of the women and others that you were working with into government?
Yeah, thank you. So before I was elected in 2020, and I represent a constituency of Victoria Beacon Hill, which includes the legislature where I am now, which is on the territory of the Lekwungen people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And I was working in this community on, as you said, both anti-violence and community housing organizing, and of course where those two interact because they're absolutely tied. One of the things that I was working on most recently was around emergency sexual assault response. And I was working with the Victoria Sexual Assault Center, but also WAVA and other centers in other parts of the province, including in the north, and taking the chance to hear from centers in different parts of the province. The reason I picked up that advocacy in particular was because of my frontline experience. I spent many years on the Victoria Sexual Assault Center's emergency response team, their SART, Sexual Assault Response Team. And what that meant over time was I was helping survivors navigate hospitals and police stations and being in those places at any given time of night or on the weekends. And it was absolutely one of the most impactful things I've ever done because of how directly involved it is in folks' immediate experience and immediate needs. And what became clear to me was that government needed to know what was happening on the front lines, what was happening for survivors trying to access medical care or connect with police. And government needed to know, from my point of view, what survivors knew, that survivors were experts in their experience by virtue of navigating it, by trying to access services. And so I went from doing kind of that frontline work to picking up this kind of advocacy and finding ways to communicate that to government. And, you know, I think it's interesting, you've got folks here present at different levels of government. Fundamentally, I was learning on the go of how to communicate that to government, talking to all the municipalities in the Victoria area, talking to provincial government, finding allies wherever I could and planting seeds wherever I could, and learning as I did that how you do it strategically and how you speak the right language in the different settings, and how you pull on different priorities that people have already stated. And the learning of that and the experience of that, of doing the advocacy work, in addition to wanting to see the policy changes, part of how I ended up making the decision to try to be in this space on this side of the table. Again, fundamentally about finding ways to take the expertise that is survivors' experiences, that is the lived experience of folks navigating housing challenges or who are unhoused, to inform what we do here, because if it doesn't match the experience of people out in community, it just won't work. And so if we're here to make it work, that's essential.
So now that you're in government, and I will disclose a personal, it was my own experience. Like I came also out of community organizing into government. In fact, when I was first elected, I was on school board and also still, so in the evenings I would do school board, but during the day I was advocating to governments, obviously not the school board, but other governments to do things. And it was such a laboratory for me to understand what effective advocacy looked like. So I'm curious, now that you're in government, have you some reflections on your own advocacy and what you might have done differently if you would have known some things that you now know?
Andrea, I might answer that question by flipping it a little bit. I think the experience of having to navigate that labyrinth, of having to figure out how to talk to municipal folks differently than provincial folks, or, what committees to try to get in front of. Navigating that labyrinth, figuring out how to be persistent and strategic, I think has actually helped me on this side of it. Not that I learned all the routes to the decision making, but I know what folks in community are having to navigate to try to advocate. And so I think it's equipped me better as an MLA to help folks talk to us, or to help identify what community organizations might have an opportunity to talk to a minister, or whether they should take something to the city. So I think having done it myself, it's less that I would do things differently now, and more that I want to use the experience to equip folks in how to talk to us now, because it isn't, I think, so often about the folks I never hear from. There are folks who know how to reach their mayor or their MLA, why they would reach their MLA and what they'd advocate for. And there are many more who I never see in my inbox. And so I think the experience of having to figure out how to navigate and advocate helps me think about who I'm not hearing from and how to reach them. So it's kind of a little bit the reverse. And, I just want to add in there, I have a PhD in political science. Like, I found it a labyrinth. I had a lot of learning to do about how to be strategic and who to talk to when I teach political science. So I also think so often about our obligations to connect with folks who don't inherently know what the provincial government does versus the city. And also that PhD was useful for me in that advocacy to use strategically. I know some of my allies referred to me as doctor in certain meetings as a way to elevate what I was saying. But to just problematize that for a second, even that level of education didn't get me as much experience in advocating as talking to folks on the ground and figuring out how to problem solve. And what I was trying to bring to those conversations was not my academic expertise, but the voices of folks that I was connecting with in community. That was actually the expertise that benefited the conversation, even though the academic expertise helped me get through a door, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. As an aside, I teach about power now, in part for this exact reason, right? Is for people to understand power is not about positional authority. It can be, but it generally is not. And that expertise, whether academic or lived, brings its own power into the room. Getting it into the room, as you point out, is the harder thing, right? For a variety of reasons. Well, and Romy, so I was thinking, I mentioned it with David, like I start with cities and then go to province, and then I've got you in as federal, and I'm realizing actually, as we were talking, this is a bit about, like, it's my own subconscious power balancing, right? Because the federal government comes with much more fiscal capacity, much more legislative capacity, but you don't necessarily have, from the federal perspective, all of this access. So it's an interesting construct that I wouldn't mind unpacking more. But I'm wondering if first you can tell us a bit more about what CMHC does. We hear the word, or the mean, we think of it as a word because we hear it a lot in relation to housing stats and housing getting built. But can you talk a bit more about what is CMHC and what is the mandate?
Sure. And it's first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for this invitation. This is the third year in a row that I'm participating in the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing, an event, and I always find each experience really enriching and a real learning experience for me. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And back to the question about the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation. Actually, many of my relatives asked me that when, in terms of what we do. And I think the way I like to describe it is we're a federal public institution. We're Canada's national housing agency, and we do I would say 4 main things. We deliver on a for-profit basis, commercial insurance product for the banking sector in relationship to mortgages. So that's one thing. And for many years that we were very focused on that. So many Canadians may know CMHC as sort of an insurance fee that they had to pay when they were purchasing their first home. That's the first thing. And as you mentioned, we have amazing expertise with respect to how the housing markets in-house, and we do a lot of research about the housing market. As you mentioned, I'm at the federal level, but housing is very local. And to really understand housing needs, you need expertise on the ground. So we have housing economists all throughout the country who do research and market insights about housing conditions in local areas. So that's sort of the second activity. And the third thing I think is perhaps really most relevant for this discussion. For many decades, CMHC was really not very actively engaged in support of community or social housing sector at all. I think the federal government had withdrawn from this space, and there was quite a significant change in 2015 with the election of the current government and the launch of the National Housing Strategy in 2017. And at that point, CMHC became very much involved in sort of the design and then the delivery of a number of housing programs that make up the National Housing Strategy. Many of the programs that we're responsible for are focused on providing financing to support the construction of housing aimed at equity deserving groups, but really looking at increasing housing supply across the housing continuum as well.
Amazing. Okay, so you've got a big mandate of high interest to those across the country, all of us on this call and people listening in, and lots of people who aren't listening in but are busy making housing happen. In that broad mandate that you've got, how do community advocates access your decision making and factor into the decisions that you're making?
So maybe just going back a little bit to when the National Housing Strategy was being developed, an important part of the design and the program work was listening to community advocates and meeting with them. Our policy team did probably about a year of consultations and listening to how could the federal government be most helpful to local groups, and that really informed the advice that we provide to government as to the programs that we thought would be most impactful to include in sort of the first round of the National Housing Strategy. So I would say that, just at a very high level. And then I've been in my position for about almost 2 years now, 2 years in April. And one of the most important things I do is, I think Mayor Miller mentioned this, is listening. I feel like that is one of the most valuable things I do, because I spend a part of my everyday meeting people, meeting community groups, meeting people who have very different experiences of housing challenges than I have had. And I find that every meeting I have is a gift, and it helps me understand the complexity of the housing challenges that that people face, and it's things that I would not learn by looking at statistics or reading reports. It's really listening to the personal experiences of people living in community. And oftentimes CMHC, being a sort of a government organization, we measure success in terms of number of units delivered or making sure we get a certain amount of money out the door. But what I always talk about with my team is that each unit of housing represents a life, a family, a person whose lives have been impacted by having a safe place to live. And that's I always try to think about that as I it's sometimes it's hard because I do have to there's a lot of competing demands, but I think that fundamentally that's the most motivating thing for me as I go about my daily work.
That's a great segue. I was curious, I'm going to ask all of you this, but I'll start with Romy. Do you have a particularly memorable example of when hearing from someone about what they were experiencing in relation to housing, or for others, any other policy area made a big difference in a policy decision for you?
Oh gosh, it's honestly, it's really hard to choose. I always feel like by choosing one, you're sort of thinking that that's a more notable story than another one. But maybe because Regent Park was mentioned. I'm actually a resident of Toronto myself, and if for anyone who's a resident of Toronto, like definitely going to Regent Park and doing a tour of Regent Park is an excellent experience. And I do remember going on my first tour of Regent Park and meeting a resident and a woman who told me about how her life had been transformed by being granted a community housing unit in that community, and how it provided a safe place for her children to learn and study. And it's something that sort of I always remember in terms of of there's many stories, but each story is unique and each story is so valuable. So that's one thing from the past. A couple of weeks ago, I was meeting with a housing group for an Inuit community in the north. And the gentleman that I was meeting showed me a tag with a number on it that had been issued to Inuit people, I guess about 50 years ago. And this was the way that the government of Canada at the time identified. Instead of identifying someone by name or their family, they had issued a number to him and his family members. And I was really struck by just this person recounting that story, but then also telling me the story of the government of Canada had built a housing unit for them, which was very totally inappropriate for the climate and the circumstances of and the needs of that particular community, but that it was very overcrowded and it was not the best type of housing. But he conveyed to me just the love of his family, and just despite the housing not being that great, it was still a warm place that he and his family could live. And it really I just got a sense of that community from him. So again, another example, but I could just go on. There's a lot of very, very powerful stories of how housing it makes a big difference in the lives of individuals.
Yeah, I appreciate you doing it. I was thinking, like, what if the panelists turn back on me and say, well, what was your most memorable time? Like, it is hard to choose a most memorable time. So I appreciate you doing it. And I think, though, like you sharing it, Romy, like, I feel more now connected to these stories that you've just told, right? I mean, I know Regent Park in part because David and I met around the time that was all happening, and I was quite taken by how involved Toronto, the level of engagement to which Toronto went to make sure that they were mobilizing this money in support of community, not like just like some, I don't know, Starchitect or something that they brought in to tell community what they should like, but rather really listening to the community about it. Grace, I'm curious to hear from you about particularly memorable examples and more to help people understand how much their stories stick with us, right?
Absolutely. So I share Romy's challenge in identifying something that is, above the rest. But I also want to echo her comments on, and David's as well, on like the listening. And I was really struck by your phrase, Romy, every meeting I have is a gift. I couldn't agree more, and I really love the framing there. I think it's the greatest gift of this job is the chance to like listen and soak up from folks. And the learning curve in this job for me is like people and policy and process, but the greatest part of it is soaking up and hearing from folks. One of the major pieces for me that I thought of when you posed the question was less how stories maybe turn us on a policy question of like yes or no, this or that, but steer us in the direction of what we need to look at and prioritize. I was talking to a survivor of intimate partner violence who was in second stage housing, and she had gone really far down the path of rebuilding her life in safety and getting her feet under her in economic independence and having her kids with her, and she was ready for the next step of housing, but couldn't, because of the challenges in the housing market, make the move from second stage to outside transition housing. And for me, what that did, well, hearing from her about the impact that had in terms of, her progression and her sense of hope and autonomy, that she'd come so far and then was kind of stuck. For me, the direction that really drew my attention to was, the emergency housing and transition housing is so essential. And we have to be attentive to people along their whole journey and what the next stages are for them. And so that helped me understand that work and the advocacy that needs to take place, kind of, that we might not place squarely in anti-violence work, right? Just access to lower market or below market housing as being an anti-violence work, but it truly is. So that was really helpful for me as someone who has mostly worked on kind of the crisis side of that journey. I also just wanted to say that, and I don't know if David and Romy would share this, but at this, doing this kind of work in this way, often where I hear these stories is through advocacy groups and frontline service organizations who are reporting what they hear from the people they serve. So Peers, for example, is an organization in my community that supports, is formed by and with sex workers. And they've done some really incredible research by connecting with folks in supportive housing around gender-based violence in housing. And they've been able to share with me and with others, previously when I was parliamentary secretary for gender equity, but currently as an MLA for some of these areas, what people are experiencing in housing and out of housing. And so it's the individuals themselves we get to soak up from, but also the people doing the frontline work who are able to translate in, who know the language and the venues for government to share those stories with us and be a way for us to connect to folks to, again, not necessarily like this decision or that decision, but guide us in the area that we need to prioritize and look and learn more to keep it moving.
Nice. Okay. And David, I'd love to hear a particularly memorable experience. I mean, you talked about Regent Park. I'm curious if there were others or aspects within that that really stuck with you.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell that. First of all, I wish I had thought to say what a privilege it was every day, just like Grace and Romy did every meeting. It's just so true. I feel incredibly blessed to have been in elected office for 16 years. And you do have a real personal journey of growth. So I want to add a story about transit as well, because it's relevant to the listening. But one of the things that really stuck with me about Regent Park was the groundbreaking for Regent Park was actually a demolition. And so I got to cut the ribbon, and the ribbon was sitting in a big kind of, giant Tonka toy truck that had a big ball, and I pulled a lever and let the ball go, and it knocked down a wall. That was the ribbon cutting. And by the way, there was a photo of me in the paper sitting in that truck, and the province sends an inspector to the site the next day and said, "Does Mayor Miller have his papers to operate this vehicle?" And they shut the site down. That's a separate story, but
that's a different webinar, but that's an important one, actually.
The contractor who was doing that work took me aside and said, "Mayor Miller, do you mind if I speak to you?" And I said, no, at all. He took me aside out of hearing everybody, and he said, "Look, I just wanted to tell you, when we found out that we had to hire 25% of our staff from the people who lived here, we thought you were out of your mind." And I said, "Oh, well, it was important to the people who lived here." And he said, "It's the best thing I've ever done. So my workers love it. These young people are so enthusiastic. They so desperately want a chance. And the employees I've had have been with me a long time, said they just love mentoring and seeing the growth and, people learning trades and all sorts of things." And maybe I'll just leave it at that. I think it was just beautiful, and it always stuck with me, because those kinds of programs often, the first reaction of people like contractors is, "Oh my God, that's so complicated. How am I going to do it? I just want my normal workforce." But as it turns out, doing the right thing works in a whole bunch of ways, and some of them not necessarily always expected, but really, in that case, really, really positive.
Yeah, that's such a good point, right? Like it's the lived experience that prompts the change, but also critical is how the people around us in the community are experiencing this change, because that is often where it's not the lack of people needing housing that stops new housing. It's the people who come out and say, "I don't want this happening in my community," right? Grace, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe share another quick example of that experience of people's stories of asking people and how that impacts decisions. And I think sometimes there are these big things, and I think we all kind of like pointed to some like really substantial policy pieces or directions. I just want to share that when I was working on the emergency sexual assault response and advocating in that way, and having conversations with folks both in government and in public service and in community, some of it is so in the details, and we can't lose how impactful the details, the on the ground, in the weeds stuff is, in terms of making use of folks' lived expertise to inform it, but also how much it matters to how people experience policy. So, in kind of thinking about how we were going to advocate for proper emergency sexual assault response, and there was like, well, so what if we have a ambulance or a police car take somebody from a hospital that has something to one that doesn't have sexual assault kits to another one? And this was a few years ago, but what if we transport folks in police cars? And that question was posed to me, and I was like, "No, that something doesn't feel good there." Turn around and ask survivors and folks who are doing that work on the ground, and like, no, absolutely not. Here's what works instead. And so there's the big question of like funding and policy, and then there's the like, what does it look like for the person when they're applying for housing or finding appropriate housing, or what works, but in this case around accessing sexual assault support in healthcare. And it was a piece of that was the right question asked, that able to turn around and ask folks about their experience, that came back to something that maybe is in the weeds, but is so fundamental and requires that voice of lived experience to say, you might view that as a detail. That is a massive component that will change someone's experience if we get it right, and will, you know, deter people from accessing care if we get it wrong.
Let me pull on that thread for a minute, because that is a very tough thing to ask someone who's experienced that level of violence to come out and talk about with anyone, let alone like when we're talking police services or people who might be connected to that. So, I mean, we know it's important for people with lived experience and expertise to talk to decision makers. What's your advice to how to support people to do that? Whether you're a frontline organization who's giving people a voice, but also trying to help them use their voices, or decision makers to make the room for that in a way that's safe for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I have lots of thoughts on this, but also just a reflection that I'm continuing to learn how to do this now that I'm on this side of the table. But I think a lot of it is like, there's an aspect of it that's like translation services and navigating and map providing, right? That as an advocate on the outside, but also as an MLA on the inside, I know kind of who is interested in and responsible for what policy thing, you know, who might have some information. I know what kind of language, you know, mandate letters. Nobody like that. Nobody wants to talk about mandate letters. That's really like in the weeds. What does that even mean? But they contain in them some really important strategic things to pull on to help us as MLAs and government to know how we can help you and you can help us help you. And, you know, but so many folks who have lived a living experience are navigating survival or looking after kids and families and working their jobs. And folks on the front line are busy providing that service, making those connections. To get your head above water and look at the whole landscape is time consuming and requires a certain language and expertise. And so I think in order to effectively get the voices of people with lived experience, that translation and navigating is so important. It's a nuanced skill that, you know, requires knowledge of people and processes. And again, the requirement of us in elected office to think about who we hear from and who we don't hear from, and not just be reactive to who we do hear from, but think about how to reach folks and show up where people already are. Not asking people to come to us, but finding folks where they're already at, and be able to like hear from them where they are. And then in the case of organizations, to provide that like that link, that tie, that here's how we can find that space to talk about it together. Because I don't think our systems necessarily lend themselves to it naturally. It takes ongoing work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love this advice, like to make it a safer space, do it in a space in which people are already feeling more safe, right? Which is not going to be City Hall or a committee room on Parliament Hill or wherever, whatever space we're giving them.
And Andrea, it's often not even like an additional meeting, right? So it's the location, but it's also, you know, I've gotten a ton on hearing directly from folks on housing, but a bunch of other things too by going to community dinners in my constituency. I'm not asking people to know where I'm going to be or to think about why they talk to their MLA. I know they're going to go have lunch out of a dinner with a community, dinner at a community center, and they're already going to be there doing their life. And so it's the location, but it's also that folks are already there, not asking something else of them, going to where they're at in a way that's meaningful for their life to do that listening.
Love it. Okay, well, so I'm realizing we've got 10 minutes left. So I might have a bit of, I don't know that I'll call it rapid fire, but specific questions for each folks. Couple from the chat that I wanted to bring in here. So David, maybe I will ask you to do something for us, which is, let's just workshop this question. So we've got Colin Doyland here from the Safer Home Standards Society, who's interested in how to roll out universal design principles so that all new homes have accessibility. How would you advise someone like Colin to have the voices of the people impacted heard by the city councils and the BC Building Code people and the CMHC people? Like who should be talking to who about this?
I think, first of all, I agree with the premise. Excuse me. Sometimes you hear inside the government bubbles, people responsible for affordable housing, for example, say, oh, well, making it accessible is an extra cost. Making sure it's zero emissions is an extra cost. We need our mission is to deliver housing. We're not going to do that. It's wrong. Government's mission is to deliver accessibility, to deliver solutions to climate change and solutions to housing and other things, income inequality, all sorts of things. So I think there's a really important role for advocates on these kinds of issues to force government, which can occasionally be a bit siloed, to work as a whole and systemically and take advantage of the opportunities. So if I were advising about this, I would have people who care about this issue show up at relevant committee meetings at City Hall. I would get petitions. I would get an article in the newspaper explaining why this should be built in the standard, and then it doesn't cost any more because it's the standard, and everybody's welcome when our housing works in an inclusive way like this. I'd build from that and find allies in other cities so it becomes a national issue, and use a similar kind of strategy with the province. Go get an appointment with a city councillor and with an MLA, your city councillor, and say this matters. Ottawa's a little harder to deal with. The silos there are, concrete that's about 30 feet thick in my perspective. So I think you really need to get kind of above that and think about which MPPs or even which senators would be interested in taking on this issue. Is that a start?
Yeah, it's a great start. Well, and Romy, the CMHC has actually moved on this issue. So can you talk a bit about why that was, what inspired that?
Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned is we do have a research group. So we have a role in providing, leadership on, what is the best in housing? What should the ideal housing system of the future in Canada look like, and what are some of the standards that we could drive? We may not have the ability to actually impose these things by regulation, but at least we can actually propose ideas. But and I think to Mayor Miller's comments about silos, it is true. Like one of the big things I have is I do think I have a responsibility to work within the silos within the federal government. But it's not just the federal government. I think housing is really truly a team sport. It's silos within the federal government, but also coordinating at the provincial, municipal level as well. And you need to have a whole bunch of things happen at the same time to make affordable housing happen. But that's something I can't always deliver on that, but that's something that I always keep top of mind in terms of how can I, in implementing programs at the federal level, be an agent for breaking down those silos and, advocate for what CMHC believes is are housing solutions that create, more inclusive, better communities for everybody, and all the things about accessibility, climate compatibility. Those are elements of that, and I do think we have a leadership role in advocating for the housing that meets the needs of all Canadians.
Grace is going to jump in, David, and then we'll come back to you. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and less on the kind of specifics of the question, because I think good thoughts were given there, but I just think in terms of getting the sharing the experience with the right folks, I think you cannot the bells in the legislature.
It's time.
You can't plant seeds in too many places. And I think, at all levels of government, with your local elected folks, with folks in kind of organizations near government, planting those seeds, given the silos, planting those seeds, sharing the lived experience in as many places as possible I think is worth it every time.
Nice. And David, you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I just want, first of all, I think CMHC is doing some really innovative things at the moment. I encourage you to ensure that the highest possible standards of low energy consumption or zero or become routine, but that's separate. I wanted to jump in because if you ask the question, who is Canada's biggest landlord? The answer is the City of Toronto. And it does, I think, highlight the important role of cities and towns in housing. It's beyond zoning and planning authority. And, you know, one of my frustrations as mayor was when national housing ministers met, we weren't invited, not the City of Toronto, not the mayor who was the head of the Big City Mayor Housing Caucus, nobody. So there, you know, it does reinforce the need for advocates to speak up. It's not just people who hold positions of authority. When the biggest landlord in Canada is excluded from those kinds of conversations, you might not get the best result. And so you need advocates across the country to be speaking up in a coordinated way, I would argue, so that we can influence the decision makers at all levels to produce the kinds of results in affordability of housing and excellent quality housing that people deserve to live in.
And I think
David,
there's great examples of that. Like I read a recent report from Australia where they have city deals, right? Thinking about housing in the context of large cities and how federal government programs have to look at that as almost like a separate category because of the unique needs of large cities. So I think those are very good points.
That's great. So David, I do want to squeeze in one last question to you. The role of male allies, like this isn't we're talking about women's housing, children's housing, gender diverse people, and I've got a white guy on the call, but I have always found that we don't get much done without having men in the room. So can you talk a bit about your own call to action on that and maybe one for some of your colleagues?
Well, it's, you know, deeply personal for me because I grew up as the only child of a single mom who decided to be a single mom in 1958, which was not the easiest time to do that. She was a very brave, tough woman, all 5'1.5" of her. And, you know, we're immigrants. We immigrated to Canada. So people, when they look at me, they see a nearly 6'3" tall guy with blonde hair. Well, sorry, tall guy with white hair. God, time just flies by. But in reality, I was brought up as kind of a feminist. And so I think, you know, my personal perspective is probably a little bit different, but I think than a lot of men. But I think it's exceptionally important to have men speaking up and fighting for women's issues. And, you know, I'll give you a little example. I'm privileged. The province of BC has appointed me to be the chair of something called British Columbia Investment Benefits. Our job is to hire workers on public procurement projects, specifically with a mandate to hire women and First Nations people, because historically they were excluded from those jobs. These are well-paying unionized jobs, and the unions have been terrific at signing a CBA province-wide to facilitate this. On our first project, we doubled the hiring of women and doubled the hiring of Indigenous people. That speaks to, you know, that's getting people incomes that they otherwise wouldn't have. And, you know, I'm very proud to do that. So, you know, I think women should speak up, fight for their rights, fight for the kind of community they want to live in. And they need men on their side too, because men should want to live in that same kind of community as well.
Okay, I'm not going to give the last word to man, but I do appreciate you speaking to it. Grace has to go, but did want to remind us how important it is to think carefully and deeply about who we're not hearing from and to go where those people already are and listen and listen and listen. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you so much for having me. Sorry to jump quickly. The legislature is a deeply inflexible place. So glad to be here, folks.
Thank you so much, Grace. And Romy, do you want to have the last word today?
Yeah, so I think I'll just repeat what I said. Hearing people's stories for me is a gift, and I don't take it for granted. I feel that anytime people tell me a story, it's based on trust, and I have to earn that trust. So I always think about that as I do my work. It's not something that is owed to me. It's something I need to earn through my actions. So that's I'd like to leave with that as my last word.
Love it. Okay. Well, so for all of you listening, there were some questions we didn't get to. Luckily, we anticipated them because our next webinar, our last one on International Women's Day, is all about success stories. Like, now that we know all these things about power and voice and the challenges in that in housing for women and children and gender diverse people, what is working out there? So I'd really invite you to join us 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Romy, David, and of course, Grace, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks so much.